The Classics World on Your Marques podcast with Weeden and Jack Grover.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of Classics World on Your Marques podcast, the podcast where hopefully we can while away 90 minutes or so of banter about a popular car marque. So I'm joined by motoring journalist Jack Grover. Hello, Jack.
Hello, Phil.
Having dabbled with a British legend and a Japanese icon, we thought we'd go decidedly Teutonic today with BMW as the subject of our On Your Marques podcast. So, Jack, what's your immediate first impressions when I mentioned BMW?
It's a tricky one because BMW is one of those marques which doesn't particularly resonate strongly with me, but I have got quite long-term associations with. BMW floated into my consciousness when I was still quite young in the 90s, when it was E36s just seemed to be absolutely everywhere. I went to the sort of school where basically if your parents didn't have a Mark II Renault Espace or a 300 TDI Land Rover Discovery, they had an E36 3 Series. My parents didn't have either of those, as it happened. They had a Rover Montego and a Rover Sterling. I think for that sort of set in my mind the idea that a BMW was a very good-looking car. I think that's what they're sort of conventionally handsome. They're not. You wouldn't look at them and think they're stunningly beautiful, and neither are they unconventional or quirky. But they're just like a well-tailored suit. They're just very handsome.
I think the key phrase I'm sort of gravitating towards when I sort of think of BMWs, because I've got lots of memories of BMWs over the past 20 odd years, and that is their go-to catchphrase that was used in all of their advertising through much of the 80s and 90s, and that's of course the ultimate driving machine.
Yeah.
I think you and I discussed before we recorded that BMW long lived up to that mantra of the ultimate driving machine, and I think everything they did was focused around those three key words. And I guess the question that I hope to explore in this podcast is whether BMW continues to deserve that mantra, and if not, what happened, because I think BMW as a brand has gone through quite a significant journey over the past 40 years, certainly again through the prism of the UK market.
I think you're absolutely right. The ultimate driving machine is probably the best way of summing up what the popular perception of BMW is, and all those adverts about carts before horses and things like that, and majoring on rear-wheel drive. And then, of course, that brings us on to, as you were saying, the whole thing where recently they have not only stopped pushing rear-wheel drive and driving dynamics as a thing, they've seemingly abandoned rear-wheel drive as a defining feature of all their cars, because now you can get a front-wheel drive BMW for the first time, and they seem to have completely stopped pushing any idea of driving pleasure and driver involvement and things in most of their cars. And
maybe that's okay. Maybe the modern market isn't about hooning round a corner and on a B road, and it's more about technology and environmental credentials and all those sort of things. So possibly BMW have read the market right, but I know for a lot of enthusiasts they will lament the dropping of the ultimate driving machine tag and all that's gone with it.
I mean, I think it is the end of an era for all car makers. We are in one of those seismic shifts in the whole industry, as obviously internal combustion gives way to EV and other stuff, and the way that people think about and use cars is just changing. They have basically become white goods, and the old notion of a BMW being a premium aspirational product that's designed to be significantly better than average is sort of not even relevant, I suspect, is what BMW are thinking of now. And of course BMW have changed tack several times over their history. They started off not making cars at all. They started off making aero engines, and then they made bikes, and then they made cars, and then they didn't make cars. Then they made bubble cars, and they made little air-cooled economy cars that were no way sporty or renowned for driving pleasure. And then they moved into the executive car market, where they have stayed to now, and where car enthusiasts now identify them as. But there's nothing written in stone that has to be what they will be forever, and what they have been in the past.
I'm glad you mentioned the bubble car, Jack, because that's actually one of my early memories of a BMW. I had a friend of mine whose father, actually his daily driver was a Mark II Granada gear, so he was already a good bloke in my eyes for that alone. But in the garage, he was restoring an Isetta bubble car, and that and that was wearing a BMW badge. And round the corner there was a neighbour driving an E21 3 Series. So for me, I couldn't quite compute that the badge belonged on both of those cars, and it was strange that there was this relatively Teutonic but solidly made 3-box saloon that, you know, looked, so I think, really cool next to the rather traditional silhouettes of a Cortina and the like. But you've also had this really oddball car in the Isetta. But I was intrigued by both equally, I think.
Yeah, and then that's quite a change, really, isn't it? Because it's 25, 30 years between the Isetta to the E28, and that's a lot of ground to cover for a car maker. That's that is an impressive story there, and you don't have to go that far back into the past when BMW was really, even as relatively recently as the early 80s, they were quite a niche company. With they were certainly an outsider in the market. They were far from common, and they were a small company that made a couple of models which were very closely related to each other in a couple of factories. Nowhere compared to the likes of Triumph, which of course always gets held up as the British BMW, and arguably had that place in the British car market and elsewhere around the world in the 60s and 70s as that conventional, slightly better than average, nice, classically pretty car with a sporty edge. And BMW made bikes, bubble cars, and funny little economy cars, and then within about 10-15 years it all changed. So
would it be fair to say that BMW started life as very much a quirky car manufacturer? I mean, forget about the engines and stuff like that they did before then, but do you think they were borderline quirky when they first started?
Of course, they first started in the 20s and 30s. They started making Austin 7s, of course, which are interesting, but when they're not exactly quirky. Then they made. I'm far from an expert on this stuff, but they made a line of sports cars and coupes and sports saloons in the 30s, which were, again, not. They were good, but I don't think they were particularly quirky, and they're the ones that later became the basis of all the post-war Bristol designs. And then when they were rebuilding after the war, that was when they did the bubble cars and the four-wheel rear-engined economy cars, which then they gradually worked their way up back to doing low-volume coupes and saloons, and then they did the Neuklasse, and that was the foundation of BMW as we know it, making solid, well-engineered executive cars with a sporty edge.
I should imagine it's the majority of BMW owners today will have no concept or association with any of that early BMW history, mainly because it's probably not very well known in the UK anyway.
No, I think so. I think you probably might know. There might be some that are aware that they used to make the bubble car, because BMW don't seem to be that shy about promoting the Isetta. I think they've got some on their press fleets, and you occasionally see them crop up in press images, and when they do pieces in print or online about the history of BMW, they seem quite happy to say, we made bubble cars in the post-war era, and it's become a bit of a design icon in itself. But the other stuff just doesn't really get a look in. It seems to be sort of Isetta to Neuklasse and nothing in between. I
think sort of moving slightly forward to sort of more recent times and experiences, I remember a friend of mine traded his Audi coupe, one of the early ones from the 80s. I think it was an 83. He traded his in for an E28 525i, and he absolutely loved it. I think he thought he was some sort of Sweeney-esque character who could sort of tear around the streets of Streatham in his rather sort of careworn high mileage example. But it never let him down. He travelled all over the country in that thing with empty tea mugs sort of cracking around in the back footwell, where he'd sort of left home in the morning with a cup of tea in his hand. But I remember that car as just being, again, so different to the sort of bread and butter stuff that you'd have seen on the road back in the 80s. I remember it for its lusty engine and its excellent sort of dynamics. I thought it was obviously a sign of things to come, clearly.
Yeah, I think this is a thing which really has ceased to be the case for BMW now, but they really were a cut above the norm back in the 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s. I can remember the E36, which is the first BMW that really imprinted itself on my mind. Even then, it definitely was considered a real cut above the likes of a Vauxhall Cavalier or a Ford Mondeo or a Peugeot 405, which were the other big family hitters of the time. And not only in the sense of how what they were like to drive and what the performance was. And they had a 6-cylinder engine, but also just the price of them. They were quite expensive cars, and the E36 was relatively mainstream. It was when BMW really set its sights on going for the higher volume approach, and you forget how low the bar was for average family cars of the time, and BMW and not just BMW, but those what we would now call the premium marques were a long way above. Audi and Mercedes were also a long way above what the average white goods car of the time was, and we sort of lost sight of that now, because I think famously, of course, the BMW 3 Series now outsells the Ford Mondeo many times over, as do all the other German premium cars, and a BMW really was a nice driving experience by a company that had designed its cars to be nice to drive, which is something that didn't seem to occur to a lot of other car manufacturers until the early 90s.
And I think with BMW, actually, particularly the earlier models from the kind of 80s period in particular, they were understated in their brilliance as well, and I think that's the key. They weren't very showy and brash, and I think you can't necessarily say that about modern cars, and not just BMWs. A lot of even prestige cars like to wear big wheels and flared arches and bright colour schemes, and actually I thought there was a lovely subtlety to BMWs, and to some extent things like Mercedes as well. They wore their Teutonic qualities proudly, and they were better cars for it, I thought.
That's absolutely right. I mean, you're right. It is just a general trend in car styling that it has become more and more a matter of extremes, partly because cars are so fundamentally good that you have that the differentiation and the drama has to be in the styling, and also just modern cars, for all sorts of reasons, are so inherently bulky that if you made them plain and austere and restrained, they'd actually look quite bland and boxy. So you have to cover them with creases and flared arches and big bumpers, and they have to have big wheels to fill up the sides of the car, because otherwise it would look like a wardrobe on a set of casters, and that doesn't it takes a skilled design studio to pull that off well, and certainly doesn't play well to what you and I would call the traditional BMW look. Like I don't think you could do a classic shark nose type BMW look on a modern car these days. I can, even when I was young, I really liked the E34 and the E30 BMWs when you saw them out and about, because just they had that sleek, pointed, low nose with the very thin little kidney grille, and then the very thin front end with the quad lamps, and they had that sort of, because the quad lamps by then were quite an old-fashioned styling feature, but it was integrated into this quite modern and fairly streamlined look, and that was really distinctive. And I don't think you could do that these days, because if you tried to put a front end that slim on a modern car, it would just look wrong. No,
absolutely. I think that's a really good point. I want to, if I may, talk about project cars, because at Classics World over many years, our various print products featured BMW project cars through the pages of Car Mechanics magazine and Total BMW, quite a few. And some of them, Jack, you might even remember, but I'm going to go quite a way back, because we did acquire an E36 Touring, and it was a 328 model, I think, that we bought from a photographer. It had something like 190,000 miles on the clock, and we only paid about 900 quid for it or something. It was a pittance. I just loved it. We used it for all manner of editorial duties in the time that we had it, and then a colleague of ours wanted to take it on a road trip to the Nürburgring. We offered up the E36. I remember saying to him at the time, I said, look, the tyres are at 3.5 mil, they're getting on, they're not at their prime, and it probably could do with a service, and but it's going to be fine, so just go down there, but don't do anything silly, and ideally don't take it on the track, because you're doing it he was doing it primarily to recce a route down there rather than go round the circuit. Or so I thought, because on a Sunday morning, I then get a phone call from Germany to reveal rather sheepishly that he did take it on the track and ran out of talent on one of the many corners and basically battered it against several metres of Armco, to the point where the E36 now resembled a cube, and we was left with a car that was written off and about €5,000 worth of Armco damage to pay for, which was a rather sort of shameful kind of end to that Project Cars career, because it was such a good car, and I'd love to have still had that on the fleet, frankly, because it was so good.
This is before my time. I don't. But what was so good about it? Was it how it drove? Was it really reliable? Because that's quite a high mileage for 90s BMW. Was it really reliable? Or
for me, it sounded great. I think that 6-cylinder engine just has got a burble that's distinctively BMW. I think the E36 styling, I think you touched on it then, it was a wonderful evolution of the E30 shape, which was probably a bit old-fashioned by the time it was replaced in 91 or 92, whenever it was. And I think it just moved the game on. And then there were some people that perhaps lamented the slight deterioration in interior quality, but it still had that lovely ergonomically orientated fascia with the sort of slightly angled centre console to the driver and everything. So the sort of the ergonomics for the driver was spot on, and yet it was practical. Being a touring, it had loads of boot space, it had roof rails. It was just it could sort of do anything, go anywhere. Maybe not in the snow, but it was a great car, and you could really hustle that car, except round the Nürburgring. We did subsequently get another BMW project car, this time an E39, but I'm pretty sure it was badged a 523 because it was the lower output 2.5 litre.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that would be a 2.5 that's been detuned. Yeah, we
bought that at an auction again for probably 1,100 quid or something, and it didn't have that many miles on it. Actually, it was pretty good. Again, we did some great stuff with that. We went through all the maintenance of it and did all the bits and pieces, and then actually we did that, I think, through Car Mechanics, and then handed it over to Total BMW, who then took it a little bit further and added some slightly styled bumpers and nicer wheels, and took the wood veneer out and replaced that with some carbon fibre sort of fascia infills and things like that. It was just a fantastic car, and one of the editors took it on a BMW driving day, a new driving day, and we're going like mid noughties now that this was happening. So he turns up in our 1998 E39 5 Series, and even the BMW press guy went, last of the proper BMWs.
That's telling, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's even when the on-brand people are sort of acknowledging that, that was probably a peak period for BMW, because I think the E39 is probably my favourite of the modern BMWs in terms of the accomplished styling.
Yeah, you're definitely in the running. It's I've made some notes here for this recording about what my favourite BMWs are, and the E39 in touring form actually is on there, because I think one of those with a big 6-cylinder petrol engine, I think you've got to have a big straight six in a BMW to get the full experience, because that is so. BMW are defined by those lovely straight sixes, even though the vast majority of the BMWs ever built haven't had one, but the ones that do have it are magnificent. And you mentioned the noise about them earlier, and I'd love to know from a sort of technical or acoustic perspective what it is, because it's not like it's a 5-cylinder or a cross-plane V8, which are known. There's reasons why they make distinctive noises. There's no obvious reason why a BMW straight six should sound any different from a Mercedes straight six or a Jaguar straight six, but they do, and it's a lovely noise, and it just gives them that little fillip of character, so that even when you're just accelerating onto a motorway on a grizzly grey day in the Midlands, it's just yes, that's nice. That's a little bit of fun into the journey.
Were you with us when we had the 530 diesel touring?
The only BMW project car that I spent any amount of time with was the lamented E34 525 TDS touring.
Yeah, that was a great car.
Which was a great car. I know a lot of my colleagues were quite, for various reasons, were a bit down on it. But I loved that. I took it, I drove it whenever I could get the chance. And certainly if I was doing any long trips, that was the one for me. And yeah, I think I was the only one who was really disappointed when it met its end.
It was a manual, wasn't it? And
it was.
And the diesel engine in that car felt a bit sluggish. But basically, unless you were in a hurry, I don't think that car could let you down. It just felt like it was an absolute brick. It felt so solid. And again, I love the E34 styling. I think, and again, for some reason, BMW make quite good looking tourings. Like, I think the 5 Series Touring has always looked better than its saloon counterpart, in my humble opinion.
I think the only thing better than a fast saloon car is the fast estate version of that car. So I would almost always have the touring version of any given BMW, pretty much.
Yep, agree with that, absolutely. But yes, that one met not quite the same ignominious fate as the E36 Touring, but it did have a moment on a roundabout, I believe, which meant that it got bent into a few different shapes, which meant it was no longer a viable repair, I believe.
It's no longer the ultimate driving machine. It went round in big right-hand circles all the time.
And then the only other project car that we had that also I now sort of wish we'd kept was an E46 330 Ci Coupe. It was absolutely wonderful. It had something like 200,000 miles on the clock. I think we bought it with 201,000 miles on the clock. So it was a 3-litre 6-cylinder petrol, manual gearbox. It was all a bit baggy, but when we went through it as a project car, as we do, and brought it all back up to a decent spec, even sort of doing the front wheel arches, which had started to bubble a bit, it was, I just thought, fabulous. And again, it didn't cost us much money because of the high mileage. And a bit like you were saying with the E34, any excuse I could find to borrow that for work journeys, I grabbed it, because it just sounded glorious. It drove superbly. Yeah, that was a phenomenal car. So some really positive BMW memories through those project cars.
You can't really get more archetypal BMW than a 3 Series coupe with a big straight 6 in the front and a manual gearbox in the middle. That is, if you ask someone to picture the perfect BMW, I think certainly a lot of car enthusiasts would basically come up with something like that of one generation or another. But that's it, really, isn't it? That's what BMW is about as far as the car nerds go.
Yeah. No, indeed. Now, I mean, with BMW, we talked about its quirkiness and everything like that. How does BMW fare against its competitors, both sort of then and now? You know, I'm sort of thinking, you know, we associate BMW as being a bit quirky, certainly through the 60s and 70s. And it obviously starts to become mainstream come the 80s. And arguably a lot of its German peers, Mercedes and Audi and the like, were doing very much the same journey in terms of UK acceptance. But how do you think BMW fare against rivals, whether it's Mercedes, Audi, or someone like Jaguar or Lexus even?
I think in general, they deserve the general perception that they are as good, if not better, all round. I think it is the all-round package that BMW seems to be able to do better. I think in terms of 80s and 90s cars particularly, if you compare, say, the BMW E30 to the Merc W201, what would be called the 190E, that was Mercedes' first real attempt at a proper compact executive car, and that was designed on a huge budget. The E30 was also fairly new, but the E30 was in turn just a very gradual evolution of the classic BMW design going all the way back to the 60s, so it was quite old-fashioned in a lot of ways, certainly under the skin, and the Mercedes wasn't. In terms of build quality and refinement and longevity and ride quality, my experience of driving W201 Mercs is that they are, in those aspects, far superior to the BMW. But Mercedes of that time being Mercedes, they are tuned for comfort, not speed, and not driving pleasure. You know, they've still got a steering box, and it's a steering box with quite a low ratio, and they haven't put any. They've designed the steering system to remove as much feel as possible so that it's easy to drive. And obviously BMW don't do that. And this is the thing that I've always appreciated about BMW, even though I would never count myself as a particular BMW fan, is that even in a base spec BMW, like I take a 1980s E30 316, it still got nice steering, it's got a nice smooth gearbox, while the Mercedes one isn't. Even though a 316 is not fast and you've got to work the engine really hard, it's very sweet revving and it's a pleasure to use. And even though the rear suspension is basically the same as you'd get on a 1960s Triumph, it's good enough, and it feels a little bit more alive than the Mercedes, which is very, very capable but a bit numb. Jaguar haven't got the build quality; they've got the engine. I think the AJ6 and the AJ16 Jaguar engines are probably the only ones that come close to the BMW straight sixes in terms of character and just excellence. I think they obviously haven't got the build quality, and they haven't got the sportiness, or didn't until quite later. I think those are the two that immediately come to mind.
I'm really interested by that comparison between the E33 series and the 190, because again, I'm fans of them both, but what you're highlighting there, which is a really interesting point, is how different Mercedes and BMW were in terms of their product, both in terms of perception and probably reality, in terms of one was perhaps a bit more grown up, a bit more civilized, ready for comfort and sort of long distance. Whereas, again, the BMW was probably more the kind of, dynamic choice. And the two, therefore, were quite different. And arguably that difference has eroded over the years. And you might even argue that the Mercedes is the more dynamic package now than the BMW. So that's kind of interesting how those brands have evolved themselves over the past 30 odd years.
I mean, they've certainly moved together, haven't they? BMW spent quite a lot of the 90s trying to become more sophisticated and more refined, and Merc spent a lot of the 80s and 90s trying to become more sporty. And they sort of met. They at least met in the middle. I have not got enough experience of more modern BMWs to know if they actually swap places. I know you can say some stuff on that, but definitely they were definitely working towards each other, almost trying to steal each other's marketing pitches.
I don't know whether I mentioned it in a previous podcast, but I was an editor of a one-make title, which gave me the opportunity to compare BMWs of various vintages against...
Is it a certain mark with a sort of a leaping feline logo built in the Midlands?
Exactly. I can't imagine what car company I'm talking about. But what was really interesting, some of the more memorable twin tests I did, for example, we did a E34 M5 versus an X300 Jaguar XJR. It was a great day out. I absolutely adored it. But they were so different. It was almost not really a twin test. I think the only thing that vaguely held them together was the size of the footprint they held on the road and their price at the time. I mean, I have to say a E34 M5 would probably be significantly more expensive than an X300 XJR now, but at the time they were probably roughly about the same price point. But even though the XJR was the hardest and the sportiest of the XJ saloons, it was still a 3-seater sofa compared to the M5, which was this solid hewn of metal that was so rigid and taut. They were incredibly different cars. I'd have had them both, frankly, but for different sort of journeys, I think. But we did the same with an 840. I took the BMW 840 and put that against an XK8. Again, just chalk and cheese, really. The XK8 was so svelte and soft and comfortable compared to the 840, which was solid and a bit brutish. But they both were, glorious. And what was the most telling thing that I remember from that was just how well the BMW had worn its miles compared to the XK8. Because I think the 840 had more miles on the clock than the XK8, but actually looked like it had half the number of miles again, because it was so solid and well built and had no kind of signs of wear and tear in the interior, whereas the XK8 started to show a little bit of wear on the leather and all that kind of stuff. So the reputation for good build quality was very much deserved, I think.
So it sounds very much like they were playing to their stereotypes, where you really, really want to get a BMW with Jaguar suspension and steering, really, don't you?
Yes, you definitely, like a combination of both marques would probably bring you out with the either the absolutely utopian mix or a complete abomination. I don't know what you'd end up with, but that's what you've got to hope for. I think I'd quite like to take a quick break at that juncture. There's still loads more I want to talk about with BMW. We've waxed lyrical about all their great cars, but there are a few oddballs which I want to cover after the break, as well as look at some of the brighter times with BMW, certainly when it came to a greater prominence in the UK, and perhaps we can speculate on where we think it might have gone wrong for BMW. It's obviously all subjective, so we'll take a quick break and we'll see you on the other side.
Looking forward to it.
If you're into BMWs, look no further than BMW Car and Performance BMW magazines. BMW Car is your monthly fix, covering all aspects of owning, driving and enjoying your Munich motor. Whether you're into a classic 2002, ubiquitous 3 Series or something sportier like an M Sport Saloon or Zed Car, BMW Car is the magazine for you. For tuned and modified BMWs, there's Performance BMW. Published 6 times a year, it's the definitive roundup of the world's best modified and customised BMWs. To subscribe to either of these titles from as little as $21.99 or to buy back issues, visit shop.kelsey.co.uk. Prices quoted are for UK only. Overseas rates apply. You're listening to the Classics World on Your Marques podcast with Phil Weeden and Jack Grover.
Well, welcome back everyone to Classics World on Your Marques podcast. This episode we're talking about BMW, Munich's finest, no less. And I think we spent much of the first segment talking about some of the better models that we have fond memories of. And I'd like, Jack, if possible, to cover probably what I've termed the oddball cars. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean bad cars, but just ones that I think perhaps made people go, that's perhaps not part of the script or not part of the original DNA that I would imagine.
And it's interesting how, when you think about it, how many of those there are actually, because you always, maybe it's just me, but I always think of BMW as being a relatively conservative car maker where they basically just make the 3, the 5, the 6 and the 7, and then obviously they start splitting the difference with all the 2 series and 4 series and stuff. But actually, when you look back at it, they've actually, every sort of 5-10 years they just sort of let their hair down and plop out something that makes you think, that's not the BMW script.
Yeah, I'd love to know if it's a conscious thing. Like, did they get a bit too comfortable and then go, right, what we need to do now is shake it up and make the world take note that we're still here and doing stuff, because we're going to do something really controversial to make you sort of wake up and see what we're doing. I don't know. My first memory is the 8 Series is the one I want to sort of refer to, because I think I actually really like the 8 Series, and it would definitely be on one of the cars I'd like to own, having driven a couple in my time. But I know it was certainly from back in the day, that sort of reading the reports in the car magazines, it was a car that I don't think matched the original brief when it was first planned. Like I think it became quite a cumbersome, bulky Grand Tourer rather than a refined, sort of honed, well-tuned sports car, which I think is certainly how it was perhaps initially tipped off to the motoring journalists of the time, because I remember it being sort of labelled the Ferrari chasing BMW or the Porsche chasing BMW, and actually it was more a kind of Mercedes SL, sort of Jaguar XJS type boulevard chasing Grand Tourer type thing. Yeah,
that's the impression I get. I get the impression that it suffered somewhat from a sort of combination of marketing hype, which it couldn't live up to, and a shifting brief as it was being developed. I remember in in our first Jaguar episode, you made the point that the XJS struggled because the reality of what it was obviously the direct replacement for the E-Type, and the E-Type had become a very different car to what everyone thought it would be, and the XJS was a very good replacement for that, not the original early 60s E-Type that everyone still had in their minds. And I think the 8 Series has that sort of problem because it came straight after the 6 Series, which is exactly that, more focused, lighter, smaller, more performance orientated coupe, except that if you actually look at where the 6 Series had gone by the late 80s, you could get 6 Series with aircon and leather seats and inbuilt fridges, and most of them had rather slushy 4-speed automatic gearboxes and things in them, and it had become a GT, not a sports coupe. And the 8 Series was a very good evolution of that, but that's probably not what people wanted or expected it to be.
Oh, that's really interesting, because I have to say the E24 6 Series does kind of fall off my radar a bit. I had a friend that owned one actually, and he adored it so much so that he then replaced it with another one. But I don't remember them that well, or indeed kind of what they were like or what they were meant to be like. And I believe it's the anniversary of the E24 6 Series in 2021. I think it's 45 years, I think, since it first came out. But what you're saying is that model did change in itself, and it probably, the people were hoping that an 8 Series would be a sort of recreation of how the 6 Series started life as.
That's the impression I get. I mean, I having never driven any sort, I admire the E24 6 Series from afar, and I've got several books about them, and one of which is one of those compilations of reprints of all the road tests throughout its life and things. And so for as long as I can remember, almost, I've been absorbing everything that I can know about the E24, because I just think it looks fantastic. And I don't think I'd go as far as to have an M635, but definitely a straightforward 635 CSI would be one of my, not only one of my all-time favourite BMWs, but probably one of my all-time wishlist cars. It was never, even in its early form, the E24, the 6 Series, it was never a hard-edged racing car. It was never even as sporty as the E-Type was in its earliest form, but it was closer to that when it started, and then it got softer and heavier and more luxurious, and apart from the M version, of course, which came out late, but that equally may have also distorted the perception of what the 8 was going to be, because of course there never was an M8. But of course that was buying into that whole late 80s, early 90s thing where luxury coupes, well, coupes in general, and particularly sort of luxury ones, went through a bit of a fashion craze, and then it sort of evaporated almost as soon as it got going, leaving BMW looking a little bit off kilter.
It's interesting, I was thinking about sort of what we've just discussed over the 8 Series, about how BMW is this sporting marque, and yet actually the sports cars that it has made aren't as polished as the sporting saloons and tourings that they've done. And maybe there's something in that. The sporting DNA definitely works when they're sort of fettling a traditional 3-box saloon or a hatchback or an estate car, or even a sort of a kind of coupe like the saloon derived ones, the E46 stuff. But as soon as they go like purposefully sporty, maybe that's when it slightly goes awry. But the next car that I consider to be certainly an oddball, or one that sort of makes you sort of raise an eyebrow or two, is the Zed Cars. You certainly couldn't get wackier than the Z1, with the doors that fall into the seals and things. I remember being blown away by it. I thought it was a fabulous, funky piece of kit, but I had no desire to own one. I just thought I'd like to look at it.
No, see, I've actually going to put my notes here. I've put the Z1 and in fact the M1, which is obviously a whole different kettle of fish, into this category. But Z1, it said I would love to drive one, but I would almost certainly not want to own one. Maybe I drive one and it would be so amazing driving around with no doors that I would. But other cars you can drive with no doors that probably aren't quite as compromised. But yeah, I think there's a fantastic concept, and I say one of those things where you can almost see BMW thinking, we've been stuck in our groove a bit. How do we break out of it to make people really sit up and pay attention? And we'll make a car where you get into it by the doors disappearing into the sills. And where's that come from? It's a fantastic concept, and I think it looks great. But nearly all the BMW sports cars are all just based on platforms and drivetrains and running gear from the saloons. And I think you're absolutely right. I think BMW's, despite its reputation as a sporting marque, where their real heritage and their excellence is in making sporty saloons / coupes estates, but it's taking normal cars and making them drive nicely with a sporting edge, not making out and out sports cars. And when they try that, it's not they haven't. I don't think they've got the institutional expertise to do it, and they haven't got the raw materials to do it with, because they never make a purpose-built sports car. It's always made out of bits of E30 or bits of E36.
What I don't know if you've ever driven a Z3. Oh, you would have done, because you did that Welsh road trip with us. Yes, the Z, because the Z3 is another fascination for me, because in many ways the styling, again, beauty's in the eye of the beholder and all of that. But the styling is just so off key for what I would have associated BMW with at the time. I kind of know what they were trying to achieve, and actually, 20 odd years later, I think it's kind of aged well. I think it's a distinctive shape. You can't deny that. Whether you like it or not is another thing. The 4-cylinder cars, I think, were pretty humdrum. The mechanicals were pretty basic, and early Z3s were slammed at the time for their dynamic prowess, or lack of, I should say. But you and I will remember that trip to Wales that we did in all those roadsters that we referred to in the Honda podcast. It's funny, we're going to constantly refer to Jaguars and a Welsh road trip, I think, in the next few podcasts. I think that should be our mission, and a certain one-make Jaguar magazine. But the Z3 I thought was, in a way, deeply underwhelming, and yet it was actually a perfectly nice car, but perhaps not by the standards that we would expect from BMW.
Yeah, you do wonder if you could somehow go into the Z3 1.8 with a completely blank mind and just have no preconceptions or no pre-knowledge of what it actually is underneath, which is a E36 compact, which is in turn a back end of an E30 and the front end of an E36, and just took it for good drive around some lovely Welsh mountain roads. Yeah, it's not a Lotus Elise. It's not even really a MX-5. It's a perfectly good car. It's fun. I certainly had fun whapping it around Wales, and you have the roof down. It does everything you could want of a roadster / softish sports car. That's all it was ever meant to do, and it did quite well. I absolutely agree with the styling, that it was very odd when it came out, but in a way it sort of presaged what BMW is going to do later with that more curvaceous shape.
And there's obviously the Z3 Rotor then spawned that sort of hardtop,
the bread van
coupe type thing, sort of the sort of clown shoe type thing, which again I think it's just madness really. But I mean, there's plenty of people that like them and think they're this very much distinctive, particularly in the sort of six-cylinder guys, is a phenomenal piece of kit.
One of those odd ideas. You wonder if BMW can, if the BMW sort of product planning and design department is was continually throwing out all these odd ideas, and management was sort of batting them away continuously. And every now and then, one of them would get through, and you'd get a Z1 or a bread van pop out, or whether it was much more concerted than that. Whether it was a case of we need to do something because we've been doing 3-box saloons for 10 years. It'd be fascinating to know from someone from the inside what was going on there.
The Z3 did evolve into the Z4, which I think was generally considered to be a vast improvement, and certainly then the facelifted Z4 that followed that was even better. So I think there was a bit of a kind of, they were back on script by the time of that. But
I think the Z4 is a genuinely good looking sports car. It's got that proper classic sports car, look of long bonnet, cockpit right back over the rear wheels, and I think that's aged really, really well as well.
That's probably more evocative of the 507 Roadster that happened many moons before that. It probably feels like it's more in keeping with that tradition,
which is what the Z3 was trying to go for with that very flat bonnet and the gills on the side, but just the proportions and everything didn't work for it. But the Z4 nailed it, I think.
But I don't know. Are you a Bond fan, Jack?
I have watched all the Bond films. I'm not someone who sort of has the whole set on DVD and watches them regularly, but I definitely watched the Bond films with the BMWs in the 90s. Yes.
Oh, good, because that's going to make the next segment much more useful. Because I can't remember which Pierce Brosnan one it was that had the Z8.
That was GoldenEye, I think.
GoldenEye, there we go. So was that Brosnan's first foray into the Bond?
It was the new Bond for the 90s, and new Bond, new decade, new car.
Because other than its cameo in that, the Z8 kind of didn't hit a radar at all for me.
No,
it shouldn't it have been more spectacular? Shouldn't it have sort of completely gazumped some of the other sort of sporting manufacturers?
Yeah, you'd think so. I mean, it took me ages to realise that I only knew of the Z8's existence from the Bond film, and it took me quite a while before I learned that actually it did exist as a production model, and it wasn't just either a concept car or something that they'd made for the film. I've
been reliably informed that our Bond knowledge, Jack, is several years out of sync, because our erstwhile producer Joe is very kindly reminding us on prompts that the Z3 was in GoldenEye and the Z8 was in The World Is Not Enough, which probably is what went wrong with the Z8. It just wasn't enough for the world, and that was it. It didn't quite work out. In a way, I quite like the styling of them, but it obviously ceased to grab anyone's attention at all, and it seemed to sort of disappear into obscurity, and that was kind of the end of it. I genuinely don't know. It must be under a Missing Persons Act somewhere, because I don't really recall, when it was launched and when it disappeared, but it just didn't seem to make the impact that perhaps BMW hoped it would.
We can obviously catch all this egregious factual errors in the edit and go back and appear like we know what we're talking about.
Yes, please, let's do that, yes.
No, I don't know what went wrong with the Z8, because I think of all the BMW Z sports cars, I think it's the best looking. It's definitely it's the one that nails that 507 look.
Yes, agreed.
I think it had a 5 litre or just under 5 litre V8 in it, and it should have been the best of the lot, and I think it's a very good looking car. And
of course, the flip side now is that they're very rare, as I understand it, and now quite expensive.
Yeah, wasn't it massively expensive even when it was new? I think it wasn't that the problem, that it was because it wasn't unlike virtually every other BMW sports car. It wasn't just based around bits of 3 Series. Didn't it have I think it had a sort of completely bespoke, I believe it was aluminium or some exotic material platform. It's just interesting that you're right. It just doesn't get a look in or even really appear in the sort of the BMW story, when really it should have done.
A bit too expensive and kind of missed the mark. A bit like Pierce Brosnan in The World Is Not Enough. So
that we definitely know about. Yes.
Yes, that we definitely know about. Yes, I did love Sean Connery and his Z4 in Goldfinger. I thought that was excellent. That was very good. Anyway, so yeah, from the Z cars, I also then want to talk about the X cars, because I mean, I'm going to imbue all my prejudices against SUVs because I still to this day do not understand why anybody would rightfully buy a car that's heavier, more bloated, is less fuel efficient than the comparable hatchback or estate that it's typically derived from, without needing four-wheel drive or the ground clearance that they think they do. But anyway, BMW, like a lot of manufacturers, obviously tapped into that zeitgeist that said we all need to be sitting 30 centimetres higher and have the four-wheel drive ability to drive up a mountain, even though we're actually just going to go to Tesco. And obviously started the X5, which then spawned the X3 and the X1, and don't get me started on the X4 and the X6. The X5, obviously at the time, would have felt like, again, a very strange diversification for BMW, and yet obviously clearly as a business case it was spot on. And certainly when you look at how big and bloated they became, the first generation X5 looks pretty good now. At
the time the X5 came out, I was falling deep into my first true automotive love, which was Land Rover. That was really where that was the first car I properly enthused about, and I did it in 1999. I wouldn't have had a Land Rover that was yet, but I was certain that I wanted a Land Rover as my first car, and I absorbed everything about Land Rover that I knew. And then despite having absolutely zero practical experience, I was very, very sniffy about the idea that I considered that Discoveries and Range Rovers weren't proper off-roaders enough because they had leather interiors and air conditioning and stuff, and everything had to have beam axles and diff locks. And then so when the X5 dropped, it was an aberration to me, not only because it was a off-roader that clearly couldn't go off-road, but it was also from BMW, which, as much as I didn't really wasn't really invested in the company, it was clearly, BMW made handsome sports saloons and estate cars and coupes, and what are they doing making this big boxy thing that looks a bit like a 5 Series Touring but with bumper car bits on the bottom? And I sort of loathe the concept, even though I would admit at the time, even then, that they handled the styling job of turning the 5 Series styling look into an SUV very well, certainly in comparison to the Porsche Cayenne, which came out just after, certainly around the same time.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think you're right. I think the X5 as an SUV is actually, very good looking, but I can pretty much assure anyone who would ever consider buying one that they'd have got a better ownership experience if they'd just gone for the equivalent 5 Series Touring or something. That would have been that would have served everything that they needed from a car. It's just that, unfortunately, modern day motoring trends have dictated that we want to sit a bit higher and feel a bit imperious on the road. And like you, I just thought it was sacrilege that the ultimate driving machine was now a sit-up and beg car that would go to do the school run during the week, and possibly the gymkhana and the supermarket run on the weekends, and that was about it. And I just didn't see the relevance in them at all. But credit to them, they've obviously made a very good, commercial case from it, because now the X range spans from X1 through to, is it X7 now or something?
But this is always the case, though, particularly with brands that in marques that people feel passionate about, that they get people like us sitting around microphones talking about what an aberration the X5 is and how it's a betrayal of everything BMW stands for. And then what happened in the years they launched it, they just went from strength to strength as a business, and that's obviously what they're in existence to do. And as a commercial decision, you can't fault it. Rather like Porsche and the Cayenne. The Cayenne saved Porsche and let them keep making all the what people would call proper Porsches. So these cars, at the very least, fill in the non-engaged buyer who doesn't care about rear-wheel drive and 50-50 weight distribution.
But you're right. I mean, and actually, that's a perfect way to sort of segue into a part of the conversation that I wanted to go with, which is, exactly when it started to go right for BMW, because as we said, that they were very much slightly left field choices throughout the 70s and 80s, and I think there was a combination of circumstances that led to BMW becoming more ubiquitous on the road than an equivalent Mondeo or Vectra. And part of that was throughout the 80s, arguably the UK as a country became more affluent and more consumer choice was available. So that's, point one. Second of all, I think there was a growing disillusionment with mainstream mediocrity, and I'm being unfair perhaps with that statement, but what I mean is that I think people probably just aspired to have more than a base spec Ford Sierra or Vauxhall Cavalier. And then the third point is that an increase in hire purchase and the ability to borrow money quite cheaply to pay for a car meant that why would you buy a Ford Escort or a Ford Focus on a hire purchase or contract hire for £199 a month when for £239 a month you could have the equivalent BMW on your drive and look a bit smarter for it. And I think all of those combination of things meant that BMW became way more accessible and by consequence more ubiquitous than some of the more bread and butter models that we would normally associate with.
The difference between Britain in the 70s and Britain in the 90s is that everyone's sights have been set much higher. Your automotive world didn't stop at a gear spec Ford. You could go beyond that into a German coupe or whatever. I think it also helps that was, of course, the two go hand in hand because one encourages the other. It was BMW were all the German marques were continually growing their volumes and improving their product and making it more accessible. Because even as BMW were riding the tide of that aspiration, they were introducing lower price models built in greater numbers, like the E36 Compact, which for all the controversy it gets was a low price BMW. Those two trends working together just pushed them higher and higher and higher. And even, of course, it helped in the early part of that boom when Ford particularly was going through the absolute nadir of its dynamic prowess with stuff like the late run Sierra and the Mark V Escort, and then even the turnaround of the Mondeo and the Focus couldn't really undo that.
Well, arguably by then it was too late, wasn't it? Because the Mondeo came out in 93 and by then the E36 was there, and as I say, probably 20 quid a month more on a finance arrangement than the equivalent Mondeo, and yet it offered just as much space and appeal. And actually by then the E36 was probably less intimidating to drive because, like you say, the E30 with its relatively humdrum mechanics meant that, you know, with its rear-wheel drive and everything, it was perhaps a bit tricky, particularly in the wet.
At the very least it had the reputation of being. I don't think a four-cylinder E30 ever was particularly tricky in the wet, but they had that reputation, while the E36 had the reputation borne up by the facts. But I think it's the sort of perception of the thing. The E36 is the BMW you can drive to work.
Yeah, I mean, I owned an E30 316 actually, and if the suspension was knackered, it could still surprise you at a roundabout, I can assure you. But that's more to do with the fact that the suspension was shot and it had terrible tyres on it, so it's not necessarily indicative. But you're right, the E36 became this very approachable, kind of everyman car, and hence your early recollections of them being ubiquitous. And while the E36 Compact isn't strictly an E36 because I think it's an E30 underneath, it's still it was an affordable, accessible car for many. Actually, I think those early Compacts have got a bit of a cult status now. I think they'll catch on.
I'd like to just talk about the Compact briefly, just because, so coming as someone who's always been on the outside of the proper BMW fandom and never really knowing all the details, like I can't sit here and spout E numbers back and forth, and I had no idea about what was considered a good BMW by the connoisseurs and what wasn't. And so when I started doing motoring journalism and falling into the orbits of people who not only knew but very deeply cared about BMWs, my ignorance was sharply brought into relief, where I just chip up and say, yeah, I always quite liked the E36 Compact, which is true, I always did. I never thought it was that ugly, and I always quite liked the fact that it looked like a sort of bobtailed rally car, because it had that really sharply cut off back end, and it had that square stance because it was almost as wide as it was long.
I can imagine you piping up at a car meet and then suddenly the record sort of scratches to a halt and everyone looks at you and sort of goes.
Pretty much. I seem to be unusual in actually quite liking the 6 Series, and I think that the tables on that have turned. But certainly I got a bit. I can remember getting not so much flack, but getting raised eyebrows for saying, because the 6 Series was seen as a bit of a flabby, overweight thing, because why wouldn't you just have an M5? Basically, every time I piped up with a BMW I liked, it turned out that it was the wrong one or the worst of that particular model or something. But I think the Compact is, you're right, getting a little bit of a cult following, partly because it's got that anti-cool thing, precisely because it wasn't the trendy one. I've driven some Compacts, and they drive. I don't think there's anything wrong with them. I always thought it was a bit interesting that people pilloried the Compact for having the back end of an E30, while simultaneously talking about what a great driver's car the E30 was.
No, it's true. Yes. Slightly hypocritical there, isn't it? But the 90s were definitely the sweet spot then. I think that's safe to say, because the E36, the E34, so there's the 3 and the 5 series. We've not really mentioned the 7 series actually, we had a project car E32 730, so one of the slower, more boring models, but again built like a tank. It felt like it could cruise forever for hundreds of miles and could get out the other end and not feel the remotest of tiredness from that long journey. And I remember running that for about a year or so, and it wasn't a good example actually, and it needed loads doing to it, but it was still a wonderful car to drive. But so that was sort of late 80s, and then the E38, all of that kind of era of BMW still played to very much its Teutonic, understated styling, still very much its dynamic sort of brand values, wonderful engines. I mean, it just felt to me like it was absolutely at its sort of sweet spot in terms of the overall package, and obviously that appealed to the audience, and clearly no one else was offering anything remotely like it, which is why BMW sort of did as well as it did.
I think really that sort of mid-90s is, I think there's a strong case for that being the sweet spot for cars, full stop, particularly from an enthusiast point of view. And I think BMW really were at the benefit of that sort of sweet spot of technology, being cars at that stage were generally reliable. They had enough technology and refinement in them to be reliable and make good performance and handle well, but they weren't absolutely brimful of computers.
That's
and things.
Right. I remember you saying that before. Of course, yes. The late 90s are that kind of, or sort of mid to late 90s is where the engineering reliability and durability kind of reached a peak before technology and electronics kind of scuppered that, really.
Yeah, and I think BMW really benefit from that because of this reputation of being the ultimate driving machine. And I think it's probably not too controversial to say that beyond quite a low point, technology gets in the way of that driving involvement. I think you end up with this string of really good cars which you can use every day and are perfectly refined, and so you can do long distances with them and you can commute to work in them and back in all weathers, and they're absolutely fine. But they have that slightly that they still have that connection with the actual mechanics of the car, particularly with the BMW with its, if you get a 6-cylinder one.
Yeah, the rare dropped ball actually from BMW in that era was of course the Nikasil line V8 engines, which Porsche and Jaguar also, I think maybe even Mercedes as well, fell foul of, with that sort of lightweight Nikasil coating in the cylinder bores. I think they all got caught out with that. That obviously all been the same travelling salesman had gone around all the car manufacturers and tried to sell them this revolutionary piston liner material, which proved to be utter garbage. But that aside, like you say, mechanically they were superbly robust. The design was ageless. The dynamics were fantastic. Everything was coming together. But you're right, the technology then takes hold, because if I mention the word or words iDrive to you, that's when it for me goes horribly wrong, because you then enter the Chris Bangle designed era BMWs, and I think this is where
these are all very loaded words: iDrive, Bangle, flame surfacing.
Exactly right, and I think this is where BMW, for me at least, took a decidedly wrong turn. I lament that period from the kind of mid-noughties onwards. Again, I remember I had a 7 Series on test. Drove pretty well. It kind of had those same solid kind of Autobahn busting qualities that you would associate with the 7 Series. But I thought the styling was off. I thought it looked like the Marshmallow Man out of the Ghostbusters or something, and I thought the interior was deeply underwhelming. And then you plug in this, at the time, unfathomable iDrive. I mean, I think most people now understand that kind of centre console kind of master toggle switch type premise, because most manufacturers have adapted a version of that for most of their touchscreens and control centres. But at the time it just looked like the most ridiculous, complicated and unintuitive bit of technology. And of course it proved to be horrendously unreliable as well. The electronics and it was all linked to the air suspension as well, I think, which sort of, if that all went wrong, you'd just have a car slammed to the floor, which would be great if you was going to some sort of custom car show, but not if you were trying to get up the M6 early on a Monday morning. And I think from there, all that kind of ageless appeal, that sort of timeless elegance and quality that you would associate with a BMW kind of went out the window. And I think the 5 Series was a fraction better, but still not perfect. And then the 3 Series was a bit more toned down again, but still not amazing. I thought the interiors were just really underwhelming. I thought the ergonomics had all gone. Instead of that lovely curved fascia that sort of pointed at the driver, it suddenly was this slab-sided, flat-fronted fascia. It was deeply underwhelming and very uninspiring. And that's before you then get into the quality of the materials, which didn't even look and feel particularly special. And bearing in mind, that's also coming at a time when the mainstream manufacturers had realised that they needed to improve their game. But I swear blind that, I don't know, a top spec Vauxhall Omega of the time was probably, not much worse than an equivalent BMW by then, in terms of the quality of materials at least. I just think it had taken a decided turn for the unexceptional, really.
So all in all, you have yet to make up your mind about the Bangle era BMW.
Yes.
No strong opinions either way.
Fence sitting is not my thing on these particular era of BMWs, I think it's safe to say.
But no, I agree with all the major points there. So even as someone who wasn't as involved or invested in BMW at the time, I remember that E65 7 Series dropping, and just thinking that, I remember particularly thinking that weird ledge of a boot lid that just didn't match any of the other lines on the car. It just looks like one of those things that you get when people are doing sort of fuel economy runs, and they home build sort of cam tails to try and improve the rear end drag of their cars. It just looked ridiculous. No, I absolutely agree with the interior. The interior, I remember thinking the interior at the time just looked very American, which isn't a good thing to say about car interiors in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s. Although it's utterly meaningless, really, in a practical sense. That 80s and 90s BMW dashboard look of having the centre console angled towards the driver just gave you that nice feeling that it was a driver-orientated car. It was more the emotional thing than anything practical. And even that diesel E34 Estate, not a car that you need to sort of insert yourself into the cockpit in like a fighter plane or anything, but it's just nice, and it just generated that feeling that this is a car that's designed by people who care about who lives behind the wheel, and the E65 lost that.
And I think, unfortunately, from there, maybe their confidence was buoyed by the commercial success of things like the SUVs and things. For me, BMW just went off a complete, ill-proportioned tangent where, it basically jettisoned that whole driver-focused dynamic sort of prowess upper ground, which I think they'd achieved over the 80s and the 90s, because then you end up with, an increasing range of rather ungainly looking X cars. When I see an X6 on the road, I feel slightly nauseous. I just think that they are a hideous concoction, really, that suit... I just don't see why anyone would buy one. Like, if you really want an SUV, buy a 5 Series or an X5 or whatever, that's fine. I understand that. But something that seems to possess, none of the practicality or the space of an SUV, but then tries to shoehorn some ungainly sports car coupe style proportions on top of a bulky 4-wheel drivetrain, seems to serve no purpose whatsoever. But anyway, I'm obviously, not everyone agrees with that, because they sell in reasonable numbers around the world, I'm sure. And of course they've even then jettisoned the whole rear wheel drive thing, which it wasn't just about driving dynamics, in as much as a traditional sports car should have rear-wheel drive, but they also managed to achieve excellent weight distribution, of course, by having, inline and rear-wheel drive. Over many years, you could tell they were just testing the waters with what if the 1 Series was front-wheel drive type thing, long before they actually did it. But of course now, there is front-wheel drive BMWs, which, are... I should come clean here and admit that my company vehicle is a 2 Series hybrid thing, and the thing is about all you can say about it, because it's not something you love. It's a practical family wagon. This
is the 2 Series Active Tourer, is it?
Yes, I mean that's a grandiose name for effectively a family box on wheels, because its only activity is going to the supermarket and back these days. It's about as far removed from an E34 or an E36M model than you can possibly get. Like, if you remove the badges and put a couple of Kia badges on it, you wouldn't dispute it. You just say it's a nice Kia. It's just not a BMW, and that's about as much you can say.
So here's the big question: is there any tangible sense of what we might call BMW DNA in your active tourer to drive? Is there any? Because a lot of people, when the switch to front wheel drive was rumoured, or then announced as a fait accompli, were saying, well, I absolutely understand what the advantages are in production and packaging and space utilisation and stuff. It makes absolutely sense, considering that there's that survey that says that 4 out of 5 BMW 1 Series drivers thought their car was front wheel drive anyway and don't care. But it would be all right if BMW make it a really good front wheel drive chassis to drive, and if it's still a good car to drive, even if it's front wheel drive, it's still, you could say that that's BMW doing their best in the situation. So is that the case? I suspect I know the answer, but I'm going to ask it. Yeah,
well, it's a good question, and the answer is no. It's obviously because it's a Mini Countryman as well, isn't it? The platform is the same, and of course, some people say, well, that's good because a Mini's a dynamic little car as well, and that's fine. But I just think it's just just another family hatchback, and that's all it is. It was really interesting, actually. I put a picture of the 2 Series on Twitter once, not because I wanted to show the 2 Series off, but just because I happened to have a Honda NSX on loan at the time, and the Honda was parked on the left and the BMW was parked on the right, and as a joke, rather than that kind of left or right question that people ask, I just put left or left. Obviously it was a no-brainer that you'd take the Honda over the 2. But what was really surprising was just quite how vitriolic people were about that 2 Series. I wouldn't drive that piece of nonsense if you paid me, sort of thing. There were some quite harsh opinions. Look, okay, it's not a true BMW, but it's also not a bad car. But it clearly rankled with people that there was a BMW that was just so mundane in comparison.
I know I keep saying how much I don't care about BMW, and all I mean is that I'm not a BMW fan. I know some people really like them and care and do deeply care about them, but even I care that, because BMW shouldn't be bland. Even the whole point of them is that even the low spec ones actually have some sort of fizz about them. And I like companies that have principles and stick to making cars that fill a particular niche. And BMW's niche was always that. They always made rear-wheel drive cars that had attention paid to driving dynamics, and it's a shame to see them give up. And the modern automotive world hasn't got much to offer, or increasingly little to offer. And to see BMW as one of the bastions of that, making front-wheel drive MPVs, your world is shrinking and sort of almost being snuffed out in front of you. I can see why some people would be quite emotional about that.
Well, listen, I'm suggesting we're going to take a very short break, because for someone who doesn't like BMWs, we've been talking about them for well over an hour now. But there was a couple of things I'd really like to catch after the break, and I'd particularly like to talk, mainly because it allows us to talk about other manufacturers. I'd like to talk about BMW's foray into acquisitions and sort of takeovers. Their experience with 3 particular British marques will allow us to loop back round and reminisce yet again about the what-ifs of the British car industry. Still plenty to discuss on the other side, so take a quick break and we'll see you in a little while.
If you like classic cars, then get your regular fix on classicsworld.co.uk. Updated daily, this is the go-to website for any classic car enthusiast. The site features the latest news, product stories, buyer's guides, road tests, auction reviews, project cars, videos and more. And it gets better. You can enjoy the content delivered direct to your inbox with our free weekly newsletter. Register now at www.classicsworld.co.uk and keep up to date with all that's great about classic motoring. You're listening to the Classics World on Your Marques podcast with Phil Weeden and Jack Grover.
Well, welcome back everyone to Classics World on Your Marques podcast. We've been waxing lyrical about BMWs on today's session, and I think we've gone through the various highs and lows of the brand so far. But one aspect, Jack, that I wanted to cover in the sort of closing stages of today's discussions was BMW's foray into other car makers, because I think they haven't had a penchant for British brands, and obviously I'm going to get his name completely wrong, but Peter Schraeder, I think was his surname, was apparently a staunch Anglophile, and was therefore instrumental in the acquisition of the Rover Group as it was. It's a yet another chapter of what might have been, because you could argue that in the Rover 75 there was an absolute gem of a car that proved that if you allied some British luxury and styling to some traditional German quality and engineering, you end up with a fantastic product. But arguably, by the time the 75 came into being in 1998, it was too little and too late, and by then the Rover brand was moribund and not desirable enough to make a business case out of it. But BMW's sort of ownership of Rover will long be, I think, underestimated for what it achieved.
I know I have a tendency in this podcast to start every paragraph with "Yes, Phil, I agree." In this case, Phil, I don't quite agree.
What? That's it. Show's over.
I didn't realise if that was the deal. I didn't realise I was just here to back you up on everything. I don't think that the 75 and the whole BMW ownership of the Rover was ever really going to end any other way than it did. I think I'm going to have a go at butchering the German language now. I think Fischert-Schreider, I think you're absolutely right in saying that he was an Anglophile. He liked British cars. He had his familial relationship to Aleki Sigonis, and which I think not so much clouded his judgment, but provides him with the inspiration and the view that if he could get Rover and just steward it with lots of German money and some German engineering help, but basically let it be with quite a loose touch, that it would turn round. And all the sort of locked in potential and heritage that produced the Rover P6 and the Mini and the SD1 and the Range Rover, all these great British cars of the past were still in there, and it just needed some German know-how and money to unlock. And I think he carried a always sceptical BMW board with him, who were much more interested in the fact that Rover provided a chance to increase their volumes at a time when BMW, going into the 90s, was still a very small and entirely independent company in a rapidly globalising, amalgamating motor industry.
But surely, I mean, my interpretation of the takeover of Rover was that it would have given BMW the perfect opportunity to develop platform synergies. What a terrible management word that is! But
that is terrible, Phil.
I'm just practicing what he would have said at the boardroom. But you'd have taken the 3 Series platform and developed, the Rover 600 replacement and the next 3 Series. But the 3 Series would have been the sporting choice, and the 600 would have been the sort of luxury refined choice. So I kind of loved the idea that the two brands could have been very much two sides of the same coin. But I think arguably my take on it is that had this arguably happened in the early 80s, when they were trying to develop the Rover 800, say, or something like that, they might have had a chance. But I just fear that by the mid-80s, the mid-90s rather, the Rover brand was so kind of sort of dead, really. It was by then just basically platform-derived sort of Hondas, and even the much lauded R8 was kind of a bit long in the tooth by then. So this has become a Rover podcast, isn't it? I've just realised. But I just think by then BMW were never going to be able to make the strides that they probably hoped they would. And if I remember rightly, Peter Schrader's deputy, Wolfgang Reitzler, was dead against buying Rover, but he was very much a fan of buying Land Rover, because that meant that BMW were actively buying a four-wheel drive brand, which meant they wouldn't have had to bother with the X models, which we've obviously talked about at length earlier. So, I definitely see all the rationale in that marriage. It clearly was, I think, probably never going to work, sadly, because I think it was all just a bit too late.
I think you're right. Rover was essentially moribund by then, and it could have been turned round, but it would have required time and money that BMW as a whole were not willing to put in, because not only did it lose hundreds of millions of pounds a year, they were increasing, and it is tantalising to think, maybe if they'd gone hard on Land Rover in integrating Land Rover and getting the dreaded product synergies, whether we'd have had the X series cars at all. And of course, Mini was the other thing they were after, because that was the other, they needed volume and something to sit underneath the 3 Series. They got that, and so when BMW did very well out of their spell owning Rover, they came away with Mini. They flogged Land Rover to Ford, and that sale price plus the grants that they got for getting rid of BMW basically meant they came out of it in the black, even though while they were in possession it lost them billions of pounds. They actually came out of it slightly up.
Wasn't there a prospect that, I don't know if it ever would have been taken seriously, but wasn't there a prospect that BMW may have been able to relaunch the Triumph badge? Because technically they owned the Triumph badge, didn't they?
I think that was always just speculation, and I mean, it's telling that the only two marques that BMW still own from its time owning Rover, where obviously it got the full set, the only two it still owns are Triumph and Riley, which are the two that had a reputation for making comfortable six-cylinder rear-wheel drive sports saloons. I think that's just practically because they're just sitting on marques that could otherwise be competitors. But I don't think they have any actual plans to bring back Triumph as much as it was. I remember people when the Z4 came out saying that actually the Z4 was a brilliant TR6. But
yes.
But I don't think they ever intended that. But
they're just teasing people like me that love the idea that Triumph could make a return, because the fact that it died when it did with a sort of long in the tooth TR7 and an Acclaim just felt like a real tragedy. So
of course Triumph was founded by a German, so all the heritage is there. It's a German company originally. So
it's as British and German as the royal family. You see, it's perfect.
Indeed.
It's that. We won't go down that rabbit hole. But like you say, they retained Mini, which I still can't believe there is as much acrimony between modern Mini, in quotes, modern Mini owners and classic Mini owners. Because there are still those that I think deride BMW's ownership of the Mini brand, and yet there is surely no debate that BMW have built a car marque pretty much from scratch using nothing but a bucket of goodwill generated by a 50-year-old rolling concept by them. I mean, they really took the brand DNA, another sort of slightly pretentious expression, and kind of ran with it. And I think what they've done with that marque is incredible.
I know it's slightly stretching the point a bit too far, but it's not too outrageous. What they've essentially done with Mini is recreate the entire 1960s BMC front-wheel drive range, because you've got a complete set of front-wheel drive family cars in small, medium, and slightly less medium sizes, which is your sort of your Mini, your 1100, and your Land Crab, and I know they're built in Europe as well, but they're churning out of Plant Oxford at a rate that I don't think has ever managed to properly match demand. And the success of the Mini marque from day one has just been extraordinary. I know it's had its ups and downs, but it's I can't imagine that happening if Rover was still around as an independent entity. And I was sympathetic to all the angst that came from the classic Mini crowd when the new one was launched, because if I wasn't a Land Rover fan when I was young, I was definitely I was a Mini fan, was number two definitely. If I didn't have a Land Rover as my first car, it would have been a Mini. But I knew in my heart of hearts that a proper Mini, or what those fans would have called a proper Mini, would not have succeeded at all. Certainly not anything like what the one we actually did. I love that Rover spiritual concept from the mid-90s. That's the way to do it. If that is an absolutely true to the original Isagonis Principles update of the Mini, and it's it's perfectly named. It is the spiritual update of an innovative, basic city car. But BMW are absolutely right to not do that and go with the retro, premium, hot hatch, focus on the handling, not the space.
Because there's one thing, isn't there, about doing a retro pastiche of a car, and there's other marques that did it. Volkswagen did it with the Beetle, and Chrysler did it with the PT Cruiser, and all these sort of things. There was lots of sort of retro pastiche kind of cars that tried to hark back to their heyday. But actually, what the Mini did, while it was definitely derivative styling, it did underpin it with, great driving dynamics. The BMW, I have to say, were a bit tedious when they ad nauseam would trot out at motor shows. What we love about the Minis is its go-kart handling, and it's like some PR or comms expert told them to say that because it kind of was a kind of universally understood expression that probably spread across different languages and cultures that made everyone understand what a go-kart is. But I found that quite tedious. But what it actually meant in practice was that they had developed a car, like you say, that was genuinely still fun, relatively affordable, global appeal. It mirrored everything that the original Isagonis car did in that respect. Yes, it's big and bloated, but
exactly, they trawled through the why do people like the Mini files, and they said, well, it's the looks, it's the cute looks, and it's the fact that it's fun to drive, and that's what they kept. And they didn't bother with you've got to be able to fit a family of 5 in it, and it's got to be less than 10 feet long, and it's got to be able to carry milk bottles in the door pockets and all that stuff. And you've got to be able to sell it for less than a Ford Escort and any of that stuff. And they stuck to the stuff that worked, and it clearly did. And I think it's interesting that with the Rover 75, which also harked back, they got it completely wrong, because they harked back to the wrong sort of harking back with the wood and the leather and the pipe and slippers and the chrome, and it didn't work. Same problem as the Jaguar S-Type.
So you probably think they should have harked back to, say, the P6 maybe, or something a bit more contemporary but still luxurious or something. I
don't like the 75 purely from its aesthetic start, its aesthetic character. I think they are lovely to drive, and they've got that lovely supple ride handling balance and whatever, but I just don't get on with the looks or the interior. And I think what I would have liked to have seen is exactly as a retro, not so much a retro as a spiritual incarnation of the Rover P6. But the problem, of course, Rover were never really a conservative company. They were actually always quite innovative. Even the Auntie P4 Rover was a very innovative car in its way. The 75 almost sealed the deal on Rover as being a fuddy-duddy backward-looking mark for people who didn't care about driving, even as unfair as that was. And the problem is, of course, if you do a Rover properly, you end up with something that's very close to a BMW.
Yeah, see, that's a very interesting take. I hadn't thought of that, and that's a really good point.
I mean, what you actually end up with something that's probably spiritually closer to a Mercedes, but you end up trying to split that line between a proper Rover and a BMW, and that requires a very, very fine line. They could have done it, if they'd made Rover were never sporty. They had very advanced chassis technology a lot of the time, and they drove well, but they're not sporty. So you can, and it's rather like that Merc comparison. You can make Rover as the comfort mark, and BMW still has that sporty edge, and BMW have the classical handsome styling. They could have let Chris Bangle loose on the Rovers, make them the innovative, slightly avant-garde, odd-looking, controversial ones, because the Rover P4 and the P6 and the SD1 were controversial and cutting edge when they came out, and yet they could have done it that way. But that's a very brave decision. It would just cost them so much to keep developing that it wouldn't stack up. But if we're having a fantasy car company from the late 90s, that's what I'd have liked to have seen.
There's still time, Jack. You could pitch this to the board of BMW. You never know. But I mean, going back to the Mini, I mean, I think having watched the Mini journey from pretty much the '97 concept car that was sort of wasn't it just a rebodied Fiat Punto or something with a beer can stuck in the back to make it look like a funky exhaust. But from watching that early concept car right the way up to the launch models, and we launched Modern Mini magazine in 2006, because by then there was already quite a growing club fraternity. I think it really captured that sort of essence. And of course, as the original cars started to gain in value and rarity, I suppose, it meant that people that wanted to buy into that kind of scene, and that's the modern cars allowed them to do that. They could buy a funky car for not much money. They could modify it and personalise it in very much the same way that the original cars used to be done. So I just think that the Mini thing was great. And I know BMW took some wrong turns by their own admission. I think things like the odd kind of Clubman with its funny door, and the coupe and roadster models that came out,
and the Paceman and stuff like that, yeah.
All those kind of really weird stuff were interesting experiments that ultimately didn't work. But you can't deny that BMW's investment and faith in the Mini brand has been, I think, an absolute sort of blueprint, I think, for how a car manufacturer can take the raw sort of seed or genesis of an idea and really run with it. And I think it's been a perfect sort of complement to the BMW family,
I think the other one, which doesn't get talked about as much because it exists in a much more rarefied stratosphere, is Rolls-Royce. I think BMW have, again, they started Rolls-Royce essentially from scratch, because they were left holding the badge and the name, but no engineering or no factory, no rights to any of the existing Bentley or Rolls-Royce cars. And they have from scratch not only rebuilt Rolls-Royce, but taken it to a point that I don't think it's probably not been in since the 1930s. It's Rolls-Royce. The Rolls-Royces are fantastic pinnacle of luxury cars again. And in the 80s and 90s, they were a little bit not that. They were very expensive, and there's a lot nice about them. But you sort of sit in an 80s or 90s Silver Spirit and you think, is this really the best car in the world? Is this really worth 3 times as much as an S-Class or anything like that? And then you sort of look at a modern Phantom or a Wraith or a Ghost, and you think, yeah, this is the spirit of Rolls-Royce back up and running.
You're absolutely right. BMW's tenure of Rolls-Royce has again been exemplary. How respectful they've been to try and reignite, the qualities of a Rolls-Royce. And for many, I think probably myself included, I still regard a Rolls-Royce as quite ostentatious, maybe a bit too much for my tastes, but there is no denying the presence and the quality and everything that you associate with Rolls-Royce, and it hasn't become one of those sort of brands where people will compare other inanimate objects with, this is the Rolls-Royce of hotels, or it's become that benchmark of quality.
I think Rolls-Royce have quite an active sort of legal department chasing down people who use it as an adjective like that, because obviously the whole reputation of the brand's at stake if people start describing themselves as the Rolls-Royce of plumbers and stuff like that. If you look at the Mini and the first of the new series of Rolls-Royce Phantoms, that just shows that BMW were very good at looking at what the essence of a marque is and its history and what people want of it, and then completely reinventing it, but yet keeping all those tangible bits the same. And it's interesting that they didn't do that with the Rover 75, or they couldn't do it with the Rover 75, and arguably they haven't been able to do it with BMW. They seem to have a better track record of keeping other companies relevant and updating their image and staying true to their values than they do with their own.
Maybe because they're just a bit more removed from it. Maybe they can take a slightly dispassionate, objective look at a brand and position it in such a way that is true to the Marque's values and in a way that doesn't conflict with BMW's own positioning. So maybe that's where the Mini and Rolls-Royce thing works very well. They've got Mini as a kind of junior, younger brand beneath BMW, arguably, and Rolls-Royce is the kind of grown-up, even higher end.
Yes, and of course you don't have that problem with the potential problem with Rover done properly, which is that it would end up overlapping with BMW, particularly as the BMW range expands. Mini and Rolls-Royce haven't got that problem, so maybe that is it. Maybe it's just maybe Rover was too close of a match, and they just never quite got a handle on how to differentiate it properly.
What might have been, because I'm pretty sure the Rover 45 replacement that was obviously ultimately it never came to fruition is the basis for the 1 Series.
I believe that is the case. I don't think that's ever been officially confirmed, but I think it has all but been officially confirmed. And I certainly, if you look at the styling mock-ups and the development bucks, you can see that there's a family resemblance, at least in the 1 Series.
I think it's things like the A pillar and the door mirrors of the original 1 Series. They look more Rover than they do BMW, and of course, subsequent generations of the 1 Series become more BMW. But that first generation one, in terms of its overall proportions, just looks definitely decidedly Roverish. I guess it's testimony to BMW that we've had so much to talk about, really. I mean, I wanted to just have a very brief point, if I may, about the kind of current state of BMW, because I've got a BMW on the drive, I've owned other BMWs in the past, and yet I look at the current generation of cars and I'm pretty certain that I'm not going to replace my BMW with another BMW, because I think the combination of the current bucked teeth styling that they've just introduced and some rather questionable social media marketing has made me sort of think, I don't think I know where BMW is now. I think, going back to what we said at the start about the ultimate driving machine, I think they are now so far removed from that. I guess I despair a little bit about where BMW is now, and there'll be plenty of people that say, well, they're pioneering electric drivetrains and doing all this kind of cool stuff. But I think going back to all the things we think were great about BMW in the 80s and 90s, I think where they are now is just, it's a different company.
BMW must be in a bit of a bind when your traditional brand values are all about internal combustion and driving pleasure, and you're going into a world of autonomous electric vehicles. Maybe that's why they're kind of pouring petrol over their brand reputation and setting it on fire themselves, and they're trying to get ahead of the curve, and they're trying to forcefully reject all that controversial internet video. It's literally rejecting everything that they've done before and saying that we don't do that anymore, we do this, almost literally insulting their core customer base to their face. Maybe they are just trying to get ahead of the curve, because it seems that whenever BMW do anything really controversial, the rest of the motor industry tends to follow in a decade or so, because, as you said yourself, the iDrive was panned when it came out in the E65, and then every other car has one, and the iDrive was by no means the worst of those systems, certainly in that first couple of generations. And then the Bangle styling was hated, and yet a lot of them have aged quite well, because all cars look like that now to some extent.
So I guess we can look forward to the car makers abusing their customer base on Instagram and doing all sorts of slightly weird things. I suppose that what you can say about some of the sort of questionable stuff they've done on social media is that it has created a reaction, and
yes,
lots of people have been sharing all that content saying, what's going on here? And you sort of think, well, I'd have never have heard about that post if it had just said, here's a nice car, please buy me. So
precisely.
maybe it's social media genius, actually. And while we might lament the loss of the internal combustion engine, the I cars, the i3 and the i8, and now the new iX, I think it is, they're kind of leading from the front, aren't they, with electric desirable cars. We
haven't got time left on this podcast to talk about how much I like the i3, but I really do, and I love that as a design. But interesting, that doesn't fit any of the BMW established BMW brand values at all, and yet it still slightly disheartens me to see that see Teslas get lauded as the vanguard of electric cars, when I think it's clearly the i3 and the i8 were the ones to do it.
I've driven an i3 and it's a great little car. Exactly.
So maybe that's it. BMW have gone from making aircraft engines to making bikes to making bubble cars to making M5s to making buck teeth 3 Series, and maybe for the next 30 years they'll make i3s and i8s and things, and they'll be known as really well designed, rather odd-looking electric cars, and they'll be really good at it.
So from Isetta to i3, you see what we did there? We've just done the whole catalogue. That's why we do what we do.
That makes up for your platform synergies.
Good, yeah, excellent. Yeah, we'll go past the management gobbledygook. So right, let's get our wallets out then, Jack.
Okay.
So we'll try and go and buy a dream BMW of various descriptions, and let's start with a kind of 5k and under budget. What are you buying?
I'm going to get the BMW connoisseur shouting at me again, because as sort of mediocre and unexciting as it is, I would have an E34 5 Series Touring. I would be quite happy with just another 525 TDS like that pool car, that project car, because I think it's just such a great all-rounder. I quite like diesel as a technology. I'm quite fond of it in a weird agricultural sort of way. I sort of admire the TDS from a slightly quirky historical standpoint as being one of the first diesels that was considered refined and sporty. But I think that's just a great all-rounder. It's got those classic BMW looks. I think it just typifies what a BMW should look like, and it's got that great interior, and it would do everything you could possibly ask of a car.
I don't think you'd lose out of that, actually. I think that would be a good choice. I think for my kind of 5k and under choice, I think I'd still be in the hunt for an E46 or an E39, ideally a petrol 6-cylinder example. I may struggle in some quarters because I think they're just getting that bit rarer, but I have certainly seen examples of E46s and E39s in that price bracket, and I think that's where I'd spend my kind of $5,000-ish. What about if you nudged the budget up a bit more and went sort of 10k or thereabout?
I found a specific one here. There's a 1969 Neue Klasse 1602 up for sale. Looks in lovely nick for 9,900. Again, I think the new class is just a lovely. Looks wise, it's just a beautifully proportioned car. It's got that lovely symmetry to it, and it's sort of pretty but plain. 1600, nice little overhead cam, genesis of modern BMW. We've talked about how many times BMW have sort of changed tack over the years. That's where BMW, as we've been talking about it, started.
Would I get an 840 for 10 grand?
You'd probably be able to answer that question better than me. I think you probably could. It wouldn't be a perfect example, but
I think you'd struggle with an 850. I think they've kind of gone slightly potty now, because I think the prestige of a V12 and everything. I think I could just about get an 840. And what about 20 grand and upwards, or money no object type thing? Where would you go with
20 grand upwards? Is sort of my options open up quite a bit. I have to put a E24 635 CSI. Make it an M635 CSI. I suspect that's the one to have, and the engine in those is fantastic. There's something about having the engine from an M1 in a luxury coupe. One of the later E36 M3s with a 6-speed manual and the 3.2 engine in a coupe body, preferably in some slightly exotic colour like bright blue or bright yellow. And then I go all the way back to what I think is probably not the best BMW, but certainly one of the prettiest. I'd go all the way back to an E9 3-litre CS, not the Batmobile, not the full-on racy one, but just a standard big engine CS, because I think that is just a really, really pretty looking car.
Good choices. Yeah, I mean, I think I'd probably still be deviating around the sort of modern classic-y market with an M3. For some reason, I don't really want to go back to the E30 M3 route. I think the E30 M3 is celebrating its anniversary this year. Again, I think it's 35 years or something this year.
We haven't talked about it once.
And yet there we are, the most iconic 80s BMW, and we've not talked about it in almost 2 hours of discussions.
But we have talked extensively about the E34 diesel estate.
Yes, there we go. That's the quality of conversation you get here.
Going into the areas the rest of the media will not talk about.
Yes, we're not about these chest-beating, tyre-smoking M3s. But yeah, I think I probably would have an E36 or maybe an E46 M3. And talking about the Bond cars, I probably would have a Z8 actually, just because of its sort of curiosity factor, and I do think they're gorgeous looking. Yeah, good collection there. We just need to make room for all those Hondas and Jaguars that we've also bought as well.
Yes,
so.
We're acquiring these cars at quite a rate now, aren't we? You're going to have to get a warehouse.
Excellent. Yeah, buy now, worry about paying for them later. That's what we want to do. But, well, look, Jack, thanks ever so much for your time. I think that's probably us done as far as this edition of On Your Marques podcast, where we've chatted about BMWs of all descriptions, some good and some bad. Really appreciate your time. Thanks to you, the listeners, for sticking with us. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we've enjoyed nattering away. Head on to www.classicsworld.co.uk, where you can sign up for our free weekly newsletter, and then we'll keep you posted about things like magazines and videos and more podcasts. So, Jack, thanks again. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you all again next time.
You've been listening to the Classics World On Your Marques podcast with Phil Weeden and Jack Grover. For more, visit classicsworld.co.uk or youtube.com/classicsworlduk.